A solution to the problem of English. Now that you've completed your phonogram practice, I'd like to explore another difficulty with learning English. The fact is that there are multiple spellings to the sounds of English. On page 95 of your teacher training manual, you'll see a chart representing the sounds and how they are spelled in English. And many teachers don't even realize that this is where one of the hang-ups are for students. Students hear a sound and then they are not sure which spelling to choose. Well, let's look at this problem a little bit more closely. Out of the 45 sounds in English, only 15 of them are represented by only one spelling. So if you hear the sound ah, you absolutely know how to spell it. Or if you hear the sound h, there's only one spelling. Now, 22 of the sounds can be figured out logically. There's a spelling rule or something that will help us to determine which phonogram to use. Or they have a very rare spelling. So some of the sounds are represented in multiple ways, but one of those ways may be used in only 8 or 9 words in the whole language. So that can be very helpful in helping us to determine which spelling to use. And you can see a list of the 22 that can be figured out logically or have rare spellings on page 96 of the teacher training manual. Now, 10 of the sounds, which is quite a lot, it's almost a full quarter, have multiple spellings that are very common. And so when we're teaching English, we need to come up with a strategy to help students to understand the phonogram or the sounds that have multiple spellings. And so we need to, first of all, admit to them that this is happening and that this is one of the areas that they may be struggling with when it comes to spelling. And we need to create a system to help them master those words. Now, before we dig into actually experiencing this as the students do, I'd like to talk about some of the reasons that students struggle with reading and spelling and how this relates to these multiple sounds. So first of all, one of the most common reasons students struggle with reading and then also with spelling is inadequate practice. Whenever there's something that has an area of memory to it that we have to internalize, we need to practice it regularly. And I like to visualize it like this. You know, when a student or when a child is learning to ride a bike and they have mastered or are starting to ride a bike with training wheels, we don't go out and buy them a unicycle. Except with language, we tend to not think about how crazy that sort of leap would be. If a student has learned the letters of the alphabet, then we think they're ready to read books and we sit them down and we say, it's time to read. Or if a student has mastered the letters of the alphabet, we think that they should be able to spell adequately, or even if they've mastered the phonograms. But the reality is that learning happens with repetition over time. And if we don't have that repetition over time, we tend to forget. One of the examples that I sometimes give is when I was at the university doing my bachelor's work, I was actually a chemistry major. And one of my favorite classes in all of my undergraduate work was organic chemistry. However, today I can't even really tell you what organic chemistry was about. And the reason is because I haven't used it. Now, if we're using something again and again and again, then we will be able to recall it. And so with reading, which is so foundational in the phonograms, this is something that we need to practice over time. It's also important that we understand the depths of learning. Now, there are different levels that we can know something, and the easiest level would be if we lay out, say, the phonograms or spelling words, and students need to choose the correct one. It's multiple choice. It's actually how most of our standardized testing is done. That is the easiest level of knowing. The second most difficult thing would be to see a phonogram and be able to read its sounds, or to see a word and be able to read it. That is another level of knowing. The deepest level of knowing in language arts would be to hear a word and then be able to spell it. Because if you can spell a word, you absolutely know how to read it. But if you can read a word, you don't necessarily know how to spell it. So when we're practicing with our students, it's important to practice at all the depths of learning. We need to practice in a multiple choice setting where they can choose the correct answer from a variety that we place in front of them. We need to practice at the level of reading, and then we also need to practice at the level of spelling so that we can help the students to internalize this information at the deepest level. It's also important as educators that we understand the elements of effective practice. Now, rote practice is very boring for the students and they really struggle with it. And that should be true. I mean, we don't want to do anything with kill and drill or to have the practice be boring. Instead, practice should always be fun and it should be engaging. We should use games. We should use activities that engage the students' interest level. We should have practice that's meaningful to them. We also need to practice on a daily basis. Sometimes we don't understand, and we think that if we tell the student information on one day, that they should know it the next day. And the student shows up to class or, with the tutor and they look like they've never seen it before. Well, that's completely normal. It's when we practice things daily over a period of time that we internalize them. Another literacy instructor I know was actually on an airplane. And she sat down next to a gentleman in his 50s or 60s. And they started a conversation. And this gentleman asked her what she did. And she said, well, I teach reading and I'm off to do a literacy training course. And he said, like, ah, oh, ooh, ow, off. Now, immediately she knew that he had some exposure to the Orton phonograms because that would be the OUGH phonogram in all 6 sounds. And so she said, well, sir, how do you know this? And he said, well, how could I not? I learned it in elementary school. And she said, you learned it in elementary school and you still remember it? How can that be? And he said, well, how could I not remember it? We practiced it every day for 5 or 6 years. And she said, every day? How on earth did you have time to practice the phonograms every day? And he said, oh, it didn't take long. We used to race ourselves. We could read all 70 phonograms in less than 90 seconds. And what she learned at that point, and what I've really taken away from it, is that reading and the phonogram, spelling, these are the foundations to everything else we do. The practice does not need to take a long time, but we should include 5 minutes of practice or short amounts of practice over many years so that students internalize this information. Now, we need to remember, don't assume that if you do a long 2-hour lesson on phonograms and spelling on Monday that, they will retain that information on Friday if you don't practice systematically. It's important to remember the principle that what we do not use, we lose. Practice should also be short. It's important not to bore students with long lessons in this, and it should be meaningful. We also need to respect the age and the learning styles of the students, and we need to prioritize. I think one of the biggest issues that we face in our schools, in our home schools, and in our tutoring sessions is that students are asked to complete everything, all the subjects. And if they're in 4th or 5th grade and they're struggling with reading, and now they have science and history and literature and all these things piled on top of them, many times we don't place the priority we should be on reading instruction. I highly recommend that we just set aside some of the other subjects for a very short period of time and teach the student intensely how to read. And then everything they do will be much more efficient. The same is true with spelling. If there's students who are struggling with spelling to the point that they're struggling to write words as they're doing composition, if we take a short period of time and make spelling a high priority and teach them the rules and phonograms, it will save them countless hours in the future. So now I would like to go ahead and give you some ideas for how to master spellings that have multiple options. One of the best things you can do actually is to create a spelling journal. Now, Logic of English sells a spelling journal, but this is not something you need to buy. Rather, you can create this very simply in a notebook. I have a sample here up on the screen where you can see that the way we organize a spelling journal is by sound. So this page shows the long A sound and some of the options for spelling it. In a spelling journal, students then can write down words that they're struggling with because of those sounds, but categorize them by the sound that they're struggling with and by that spelling. And this is very helpful because it creates a systematic tool. It also creates a reference tool for students. They can put their spelling words in here, but they can also put words they're misspelling in other subjects. We should also practice those words in meaningful ways. Use them in sentences. Learn the grammar of the word. Learn derivatives of the word. So practice spelling not by just sending the student to copy the word 30 or 40 times, but by using the word in meaningful contexts. We also should be using multisensory games. The Logic of English phonogram and spelling game book has lots of ideas. And in your teacher training manual, you're going to see many ideas in this section for games that you can use with your student that are a lot of fun. And in this way, they can engage with the material and not just rotely memorize it in a boring way. Another idea for you is to leverage the fact that English is morphophonemic. Now, we talked earlier in the session about how English is a morphophonemic language, which means that the language is based on both sound and meaning. So let's say that a student has a word like night, where we're using the 3-letter I. Many students will misspell this word using a single letter I and a silent final E. So let's say we want to help them remember that this is the 3-letter I. So one of the ways we can do this is we can say to them, well, what are some of the derivatives? What are some other words that include the word night? Why don't you take a moment just now and think, what words can you think of that use night? Maybe nightingale, nightly, tonight. Well, you'll see here's a whole list of words and that use the word night in them. You can find this list on page 100 of your teacher training manual. As students learn these words, which incorporate the word night, they'll be practicing this spelling and they'll be expanding their vocabularies. Another idea that I like to do when a student is having a difficulty spelling a word is to give them what I call word sums. Here you'll see there is a word and then a suffix. And this way, the student has to add the suffix to the word. They can practice the suffixing rules, and they begin to learn new derivatives, new meanings, new vocabulary words. You'll also notice, for example, in this word or in this list here, we have the word clean. Maybe the student keeps using an E-double-E, so we're wanting to practice that it's the E-A phonogram. Well, you can also notice that I included the word cleanse. Cleanse is related to the word clean in meaning, but you'll notice the E-A phonogram is saying eh. So we couldn't use the E-double-E phonogram here because the phonogram would need to represent both E and eh. And this is a way that you can help the students to understand more of the language and understand why a word is spelled that way, and then also increase their vocabulary while practicing a spelling that may have multiple options for that sound. Another idea is to teach the etymology of the word. Etymology means the history, or where did the word come from. So any word that has a PH in it is from Greek. So photography, phosphorus, philosophy. And, for some people, learning the etymology of the word creates a memory hook. They find etymology to be really fascinating. As we referenced earlier, any word that is using the CH to spell the K sound is from Greek as well. And so when you help the student understand the history of the word, it provides just another memory link in to help them remember which spelling is used. Now, when you look at the words spaghetti, linguine, pepperoni, scampi, we just learned the rule that English words do not end in I, U, V, or J. However, why does spaghetti end in an I? I think you've got it. That's right. These are Italian words. So English can import words from other languages, and oftentimes we retain the spelling from that language. And so in this instance, we can explain to the student that this is not an English word and therefore it ends in I. Now, some of you might be saying, well, that's kind of silly, but it's fascinating how young children really latch onto this. There's a story in Uncovering the Logic of English where this very young girl was driving along with her mother, and she read the word and sounded it out, jujitsu. And she said, "Hey, Mom, that's not an English word. Where is that from?" Now, isn't it interesting? At a very young age, she knew to ask the question, what is the origin of that word? And she knew how to ask that question because she knew that English words do not end in I, U, V, or J. And she was correct. Now, just a little tip for you. With the rule that English words do not end in I, U, V, or J. This is pretty limited in scope, what we will bring in. Most of the words brought into English are nouns. Most of them are even foods or represent objects from other cultures. So when we go to another culture and find something that we need an English word for, we might retain that spelling. But we don't have lots of other words. It's mostly nouns, and once again, representing something that was brought to us from another culture. And I think, too, one of the things that's important when we think about etymology or when we think about these multiple spellings is to understand that for students, often knowing that there is a reason is more important than knowing the actual reason. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've made with how we teach language is that when we have a question about the language, rather than looking up an answer or saying, I don't know, we tell students that's an exception. So I would encourage you as teachers, if you don't know the reason, say, I don't know, I'll try to find you an answer, because it provides students a lot more hope in how to learn a language when they know that there are answers and that there's a possible explanation, rather than just thinking that this is all just one big jumble.